Hi everyone, this is Dr. Orkun Bajik, and today I will be walking you through how to plot a histogram on Microsoft Excel when you are given a quantitative data. First of all, I want to briefly define what a histogram is. In general, a histogram is a graphical display to represent a quantitative data. One of the important purposes of plotting a histogram is to identify the shape of a distribution that the data has. In general, a histogram could be right skewed, as you can see on the left hand side here. It could be left skewed, as you can see on the right hand side, or it could be symmetric, as you see in the middle at the bottom here. So in general, we don't always expect the data to have a perfectly symmetric shape like this one. Sometimes it's going to be roughly symmetric, and it is going to be considered as a symmetric data for many cases, because it is very uncommon to have a perfectly symmetric histogram in real life. So I'm going to now illustrate how we can plot a histogram on Microsoft Excel. So on this left-hand side, we have a quantitative data set. So when I speak about a quantitative data set, what I mean by that is I am seeing numbers when I look at the data set instead of letters or words or a set of strings. So I have my data set here, and I'm going to follow a series of steps to plot my histogram on Excel. So first of all, I'm going to identify a few valuable numbers for me. The first one is going to be the maximum value in this data set. So to be able to identify that, I'm going to use the max function on Excel, which requires me to enter or select the data set that I'm interested in. So I select the region that I'm interested in, and this function will give me the maximum value in this region. So Excel says that the maximum number in this data set is 39, and I'm going to follow a similar approach to find the minimum number in this data set, and that will be by using the min function on Excel. Similar approach, we select the region that we are interested in, and that will be A1 up to C13. And if we hit return on a Mac computer or enter on a Windows, it will give me the min of 2 in this data set. So my max is 39 and min is 2. And then using these two values, I'm going to find the difference between the max and the min, in other words, the range in this data. So it's going to be 39 minus 2, or using Excel cells, I can say B18 minus B19, which is equal to 37. So next, I need to identify the number of classes that I will use in my histogram. So in general, there are different ways to calculate this number of classes. Sometimes the question can give you to use a certain number of classes. For example, the question can say, here's your data set, use 5 classes, use 7 classes, and so on. As a general rule of thumb, you can use the square root method, in which you look at the number of observations in your data set, and then you take the square root of that, and if it is a fractional value, you can round it up to the next integer, and that will be your number of classes. So here's what we are going to do. We are going to use the square root method, which is the SQRT on Excel. And this SQRT function requires a number for which you are looking to identify the square root. What I'm going to do next is to determine the number of observations in my data set. So to be able to identify it, I'm going to use the count function, which will give me the number of entries or number of observations in this data set. So I'm going to select the region in which my data is available, and then I'm going to close parentheses to count how many entries I have, but I also need to close the parentheses for my sqrt function, so I have two parentheses. On the right hand side, one for the count function, one for the sqrt function, and the result of this will give me the square root of the number of observations, which is 6.24. So this is a fractional number and I can't have 6.24 classes. What I do is to round it up to the next integer, which is clearly 7 in this case, but let's use an Excel function, which is round up. All you need to do is to select the number that you want to round up, and then if you say 0, it is going to round it up to the next integer, which is 7. Then I need to identify the width of each class. So how many entries I'm going to have in each class is important. So to identify that, we are going to divide the range by the number of classes. So the difference between the max and the min divided by the number of classes that we just identified will give me the class width. So that is 5.28, which is also a fractional number, and I don't want to have a fractional class width because all my data entries are integer. So I'm going to use the same function, roundup function, and I'm going to select the class width from cell B22, and then I'm going to say comma 0, which will round this value up to 6. Again, you don't need to use the roundup functions for these two, but to make things more smooth, more automatic, I think it makes sense to use those functions. So one thing to keep in mind here is that the number of classes can be calculated in different ways, okay? In general, 5 to 20 classes are suggested, and square root method is just one of the methods to identify, but really what we do in real life is to see, to possibly try different number of classes to best represent the shape of the distribution, okay? We are trying to see the distribution of the data set, and if 7 classes work fine, we are good. But if we feel like we are not able to see the distribution well enough, then we can try, for example, 9 classes, 11 classes, and so on, all right? And also with the class width, there could be cases where you will get an integer with your calculation here. In that case, it is still necessary to round it up to the next integer or add 1 to that value to ensure that every value is included in your data set, in your histogram. Okay, for example, let's say that this calculation resulted in a class width of 7, add 1 and use a class width of 8. Okay, and just to make sure that every value is included. Okay. So after identifying the number of classes, the class width, the minimum and the maximum values in the dataset, we can start listing our classes, okay? So since I identified the minimum value to be 2 and the maximum to be 39, I need to make sure that all of these values are included in my classes, okay? So it is okay to start from 2 because then I ensure that every value starting from 2 in my dataset will be included in the histogram. So the lower limit of the first class is then going to be 2, and the upper limit of the first class will be determined by the class width. Okay, so this means that if you start from 2, you can include 6 different values in this class. So you're going to start from 2, then you have 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, which makes a total of 6 unique values, okay? So that means that my upper limit for the first class will be 7. And when you type this, it is expected to have a date on Excel, okay? And it's completely because of the formatting of the cells. And to fix it, select the number of cells here and right click on your computer, select Format Cells, and select Text, because we are going to type a text in there instead of a number, and go back to the cell, start from 2 to 7, okay? So my first class has a lower limit of 2, an upper limit of 7, and 2 is because I have a smallest number of 2 in my data set, and 7 because of the class width to include 6 different numbers in there. You can also identify the upper limit by looking at, you start from 2, and 7 minus 2 is equal to 5, add 1 equals 6, which is your width, okay? And one important part of constructing these classes is to ensure that they do not overlap. What I mean by that is the next class has to start from the next integer, so that every single value in my data set only can appear in one class, okay? So we start from 8, and then the class again has a width of 6, which means that my upper limit for this class will be equal to 13, okay? And you can verify this by counting from 8 to 13, or you can subtract 8 from 13 and add 1 to it, which will be equal to 6, which is your class width. And then the next class will start from 14 and will go up to 19 because we have a class width of 6, 20 to 25, 26 to 31, 32 to 37, and 38 to 43. I don't need to go for another class because this last class has an upper limit of 43, which is greater than my maximum of 39. Therefore, I can stop here. So let's say that I continued, it would be 44 to 49, and I don't have any values that could fit into this class, okay? So therefore, I don't need it. And if you look at the number of classes, we have 6 classes here, okay? So you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 classes, which is what I identified earlier, okay? So in this set of classes, I ensure that every value is included in my classes because the lower limit of the entire set of classes is 2, and the upper limit of the entire set of classes is 43, which means that the lower limit is the same as my min, and the upper limit is greater than my max, which is great, okay? So next set of values are called the bin ranges, and this set of values will help us construct a histogram on Excel, okay? And to construct the bin ranges, all you need is to type the upper limit of each class. So for example, the first upper limit is 7, next one is 13, then 19, 25, 31, 37, and 43. And as you can tell, they are all increasing by 6, right? So 7 plus 6 is 13, 13 plus 6 is 19. So what you could do instead of typing them manually is to add 6 to the previous upper limit and then go to the bottom right and drag them down to calculate all of them automatically rather than typing them manually, okay? So I have my bin ranges, and now I can go to the Data tab on Excel, and you should have Data Analysis Tool Pack, and then select Histogram. When you open the screen, you'll probably see regression first. Scroll up to find Histogram, and then say OK. And so I have some values there, but I'm going to delete them. So make sure that if you are working on the same Excel file, delete the input and enter the new ones because you don't want to use the old values. Otherwise, you may get a wrong result, okay? So I always clear what I inputted earlier, or just start a new worksheet and do it on that new file. Okay, so to plot our histogram, we are going to answer a couple questions that Excel asks. Okay, and the first question is the input range. And it essentially is asking you to tell where the data is located. Okay, so input range is this selected region on the left, A1 to C13, because this is where my data is. Okay, so input range describes where the data is located. And then the bin range, like I said earlier, we already listed them here. So we select the bin ranges F2 to F8. Okay. Output options, I usually like to see the output on the same worksheet as the one I am working on. So I am going to select the output range and then just select an empty cell. Okay, so E14 in this case will work because I don't have anything in there. You can select a new worksheet or new workbook. They will open a new worksheet and put the output in that worksheet. Okay. And you will probably have the chart output unchecked. Make sure it is checked because that will plot our histogram. Okay. So after you listed these values, hit OK, and then you have your frequency distribution on the left as well as your histogram. So one thing that we will fix with this histogram is the gap between the classes. And to fix it, right click on one of these bars and select, format data series. And then on the right, you will see gap width. It is 150% right now. Select it and drag it to the left to remove the gap so that you have a gap width of 0 between the classes. Okay, so I have my histogram. One other thing that I'm going to change is the x-axis labels, because what I'm seeing right now is the bin values, bin ranges that I provided. But I want to fix it by clicking on just one of these numbers and then select data. And you will see that I have an option of horizontal category, axis labels. Clear it, okay? Make sure it's empty, and then go and select your original classes, which will change the x-axis labels, showing you the classes. So the first one has 2 to 7, which is my first class, and the frequency is 5. As you can see, it shows a value of 5. And the second class, 8 to 13, has a frequency of 8, as we can see on the graph. Okay, so I also have my frequency distribution that is provided within the data analysis tool pack. And one thing that I usually do to make sure that everything checks out is to sum all of these frequencies and look at the number of observations to see if they match. So I'm going to count the number of observations, and as you can see, the sum of the frequencies that I found from the frequency distribution is equal to the number of items in my data set, which also verifies that the frequency distribution was correctly created. Okay. After we plot our histogram, next thing we will do is to identify the shape of the distribution. Okay, so like we talked about earlier, do we have a left skewed, right skewed, or symmetric data? Okay, so if we look at the histogram, you can see that a large number of values appear in the left-hand side of the histogram. So like, for example, 8 to 13, 14 to 19 seem to be dominating the entire histogram. And if you look at our general shapes that we could see, so if you have larger frequencies on the left, it's right skewed. If you have larger frequencies on the right, then it's a left skewed. So our histogram, even though it's not a perfectly right skewed histogram, it looks more like this because of the larger frequencies on the left. So therefore we can call this a right skewed distribution or positively skewed distribution in this histogram. Okay, so thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you on the next one.